Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and insights from the real estate development industry. My name is P.Eng Nursalehi, and I'm super excited to be here with you today. Our guest for this episode is a good friend of mine, Blair Davies. And Blair is an expert for high performance facade systems. He's the president and founder of a company called Facade Systems, Inc. And he has a background in engineering, and he comes at facades in a very unique and interesting way. He is an expert in all sorts of innovative, good-looking, sustainable, and in most cases, affordable products that you can basically use in the new construction or reface your old buildings and give them a little bit of facelift, if you may. In the world that we live in today, that we have a climate crisis and we have a lot of construction that needs to still happen, and we need to make a lot of good decisions going forward. Facades and how they affect the performance of our building, how they affect the look of our building, and how they affect the environment that our buildings exist in, and the sustainability factors of it all can play a big role. So in this episode, we dive into a whole bunch of different things, from trends that are currently in the industry, from the role that the building code plays and the evolution of the building code a little bit. And most importantly, we're going to talk about how to approach the decision of how to select the best facade for your building. And we're going to go through a number of different criteria that you want to take into consideration when deciding what product or what system to use for your next building. And I really think that you're going to enjoy listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about Blair and what he does, you can go to our website and you can find more information there. Our website is realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. And I hope you enjoy listening to the episode. Thank you very much. And as always, please don't forget to subscribe to the show. Hi, Blair. How are you doing?
Good, I am. How are you?
Thank you for being here with us, Blair. You and I have had multiple discussions offline about topics of interest, the whole facade of the buildings, the mid-rise buildings. We've done a couple of webinars together. And let's start why facades? Why are facades important? And how did you get into the world of facades? I know you have a background in tech, you're an engineer. And why, of all things, why facades?
Okay. So, yeah, the background is I am a civil engineer from Waterloo, and I thought I was going to build stuff. And, life is that thing that happens while you're planning doing something else. So I headed off into tech at the beginning of the computer industry. And then I was in the beginning of the internet. And, a lot of that was great and fun, and I was traveling and it was very exciting. But I kind of had this light bulb or something about why I went to Waterloo and why I went to school, and it was to build stuff. So in about 2005, it left me because mostly the bubble burst and most of the hardware tech moved overseas. And I took it as an opportunity, frankly, to build a network of friendships and relationships and get involved in the building industry. And there's a whole lot of reasons for it. And I honestly kind of stumbled into this facade space just from networking and people I met. And it's turned out to be a nice mix of, looking at something while I walk away, while I drive down the street, which is what I really got into the space for doing, sitting in sometimes relatively artistic meetings and helping somebody get what they're trying to achieve. And they know that they need that help. That's what's kind of interesting about the space. A joke I have is that I've never been thanked so many times since I entered this industry. In 20 years of tech, I can count the number of times somebody said thank you, not on one hand, and then I joined the industry and, people call it, the hard world, go, go, go. Well, reality is there's a lot of challenges on building a building, and the people that are designing and building a building, they need help. And then this facade thing is interesting because back when I got into it, I joke about how it was like selling shiny things to architects because building it was easy. A couple inches of insulation, Nobody was worried about thermal bridging. The code wasn't all that constraining. And kind of what's your dollar per square foot? And what's changed is we've opened up to the bad decisions that were being made in the past. So I have a building science book that I came from when I went to university in the 80s. And, it talks thermal bridging and R value and effective R value and all the things you think of. And so as this grew, and I reread some of the building code this morning to make sure I kind of had it all, it's like 2016. Like, we're finally writing documents in the building code about these topics in 2016 around building envelope. And now what's happened, and it's even taken longer to get in place, is you take the shiny things and now you incorporate them in a system, which then makes you look at other aspects of it, labor efficiency, waste, sustainability, carbon, and all these other things. And, I like to say that it separates the wheat from the chaff. Now, folks in my line of work, there aren't that many of us. And I tend to work really well with, an architect, obviously the owner too, but the architect, a building science engineer, and myself, because architect has a vision of the building he or she wants to make. The building science expert really understands the science around building envelope, and I can bring solutions that none of those two can see, because I have a bit of more of a global network. So the facade space is like this cross point between the brand of the building, how it's going to look, how people are going to feel about living in it, and then the engineering that actually is going to make it work, not only the day you build it, but the day and the day and the day after that, decades after that. And if you think like the problems that we have with the building stock today, fundamentally they're building envelope things.
So sorry, just before you dig much deeper into that, why don't we just take a step back? I want to go back to the thank you comment that you made, and in terms of you get a lot of thank yous, and maybe I'll just put a pin on that. We'll circle back, but let's take a step back, because obviously let's define some terms before we move forward. How would you define like facade versus cladding versus the face of the building, where wall assembly, and I guess less of a technical definition, if you may, more of if I'm looking at a building, which part am I looking for, the facade, and what is the other one? Let's start from there and move forward.
The facade of a building is the vertical walls of the entire building. And when you go to a facade website or a magazine, you're going to see the solid wall part and the glass wall part. And so windows and window wall and curtain wall, and then the solid wall. Now, I'm more involved with the second part. So although I call my company Facade Systems, I actually have no role in glass, but hold that thought. And so when you're looking at the facade, you're typically talking about some kind of skin, which would be what you'd call, in Canada, we would call cladding. And then you're going to have some kind of build out to provide thermal and water and vapor barrier protection, and then structure and some kind of interior surface like drywall or something. So now that's a description of what, would commonly be called as a stick-built world. Whole bunch of components show up on a website and a bunch of people get up on equipment. And now so cladding, subsystem attached to some structure. It would be everything outside of the sheathing, if you will, would be called a facade.
So basically anything we see, sorry if I may just summarize it, everything we see from the outside and everything that is basically your first line of defense against the elements. Would that be a fair definition?
Correct. Yeah. The word building envelope, or in America, they call it building enclosure, is to keep the people on the inside comfortable while the weather's changing outside.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to circle back before we get any further. Why all the thank yous? What have you been doing? I know why I have thanked you in the past, but while I was introduced to you as, okay, guys, we're dealing with one of the projects a few years ago, and I know we came across this situation with one of these facade systems. Back then, I used to call them cladding more often than facade, but since then, facade systems. And you were introduced to me as the facade expert, right? So why the thank yous?
Well, don't think I'm that hard to work with, I guess. So some level that approach, which I learned when I was in tech to some extent, but when I got to this, especially with architects, they got to deal with like the ocean is incredibly broad and it's a couple of meters deep, right? They got to, and, and they're accountable for everything, but not responsible for anything. So, if the concrete gets poured wrong, they drew it, and so somebody's going to get upset with them if there was a detail wrong. So then they're looking for experts. And in the building envelope being tough, they really are looking for experts. And so I like to say that I'm, a mile deep and, a kilometer deep and a couple meters wide. I don't know much about roofing, for example. But by the way, I know people that know things about roofing. So you do need to know that you do need to know your network. You do need to know people, but the thank yous just come from, I think the interesting thing about this business, it's a real people business and it's a very service oriented business. So when you look at a building and you see all the components and all those systems and all this tangible stuff, it was touched by a lot of people.
Very true. Very true. And to that point, like I studied engineering as well, but I would say being a construction manager in my day-to-day job is like probably 90% of it has to do with dealing with people, negotiations and long-term relationship building and trusting and holding each other accountable, all the fun stuff that comes with it, obviously. Less, maybe 10, 20% max is technical, which is mostly what you learn in university. Okay, so let's go back to the question I asked you earlier, and maybe I'll expand on it a little bit. I'm a developer. I'm someone who's starting a new project, or I have a project somewhere in the process of approvals and design development. First of all, why should I care more, or why should I care aside from just the looks of the building? Why should I care about my facade? What are the, let's say, 3 to 5 things that I need to pay attention to when my designers, my architects, my engineers, my construction manager, my team basically is working on a project? What is it? What questions should I go to the team with?
One thing that I guess I'd start off with is you can get all the engineering right and don't have to care about what it looks like. So you can spec air vapor barriers and insulation that hopefully meets code and windows that meet code and that the details around the windows are so there's no thermal bridging and et cetera, et cetera. The parapets are done right. The doors are done right. And you can get all that right done. And you can do all that with the types of claddings or facades you see today. And you could rely on people like me and all the cladding contractors, if they're willing to spend time up front with you, they know this stuff. So to some extent, there's like no mystery, although people cut corners and then they compromise, right? There's thermal bridges around the windows and they didn't have to. Like, I'll get to that in a moment. So, but if you tie it back to what the purpose is of that aesthetic, as well as massing and layout and which way the building faces and what's going on the street and what's going to happen maybe at the retail level on a lot of residential design now are mixed use. The facade is a really key component of that. And I think the thing that gets missed is there's a lot of choice, and there's a lot of choice that's going to fit your budget. And us dear Canadians, we just seem to rely on stuff we either know or somebody knew and we've been using, but kind of don't do that process up front to go, my brand of my building is this. And therefore the range of things that I could use to meet that brand is that. And then how do I work up my analysis of what's the best decision? So if you were branding a car, then you would look at the shape of it. You would look at the exterior finishes, the shapes of the glass. I'm not a car designer, but all the aesthetics. And then you'd be making a decision that you've made good decisions cost wise, efficiency wise, aerodynamically, and your brand. So that's the piece that really can be achieved differently if people actually know all the choices they have.
So to recap, you're saying that I guess the first question is go to the team and don't settle for the first option that everyone thinks is the way to go, and ask for, okay, what are my options? And maybe if you don't mind just quickly walking us through what those, like some of those options are in terms of, let's say, some of the more uncommon ones or some of the ones that you're feeling are underappreciated.
Well, that's another 3-hour meeting. See, that's what's really interesting. Because if you go to for example, there's a trade show in Germany called BAU every other year, and
Right.
it's in about a dozen buildings, and each building has, windows or doors or, and there's 2 for facades. And
Right.
and
Okay, so let me reframe that question.
Yeah,
Say locally
So
in Canada.
So an example. So right now you'd see brick, window wall, maybe glass windows, window wall usually, block, which is what I saw in a building. I'll tell you a story in a minute. ACM, maybe some metal panel and eaves.
Right.
7 things. So, and if I'm wrong, then add 2 more, right? So we're under 10. There's, people know flat fiber cement, like the one that starts with the letter H. But there are system-based fiber cements that are a lot easier to put on, and therefore your cost goes down, even though the material is a little more. There's FRP, fiber reinforced polymer product. Depending on where you want to use it, there's things like terracotta, and there's brick systems that provide rain screen. If you're going to do a tall building, you could still have brick on a building and not affect the loads on that building. There's really cool things you can do in the aluminum space, like perforations and really interesting things in aluminum plate that aren't that much more or aren't that more. And if you tied them into your brand, then they fit, right?
You're suggesting that if you're a developer, one of the things maybe you're suggesting is think about the building envelope and the facade in particular as something that would carry over between your projects and build you the brand. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a window wall or curtain wall.
Right. And there's a piece that I've been really watching lately that's been getting lost. So if I told you flat sheet of fiber cement, the low cost material that you can buy at Home Depot, and mine was almost 2x. The actual, just the skin. So 6 versus $12. Okay. And then, but the subsystem's the same. So you still need 4 inches of insulation and you still need something to hang it on. So that piece is the same, right? And you still need the same, rock wool mineral wool insulation. You still need the same membranes for air vapor barrier, and you need labor. And if your labor allows you to avoid overruns or avoid mistakes or avoid redos, that $15 a square foot you're getting for labor, or 15 or 20 or something, completely changes if you know it's going to be a certain dollar point. But here's the kicker that people keep ignoring, and I kind of put my foot down on this, and that's waste. And way too many times am I shown a building. What's interesting in residential is the walls are broken up. Now there are some nice long runs at some points in the building, like around staircases and things. But compared to the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is, there's an addition going on, and it's fundamentally going to be a closed building because they don't tend to put windows around art. Residential has a lot of different surfaces. And if you can do it in such a way that your waste factor is low, like less than 10%, then your dollar per square foot of a a $6 panel versus a 12, 6 can become 11 real fast if you're throwing a bunch in the garbage.
And sorry, when you talk about waste, you're not just talking about material. You're talking about material and labor.
Yeah, because every time you cut, that's a really good point. So every time you touch something and you have to fabricate it or adjust it, that's waste. And every time you buy something that's say 4x8, but the size you're trying to fill in is 4x6, you just cut off 2 feet, throw it in the bin. And by the way, the labor's not watching that.
Right.
They didn't buy it. So waste is a really interesting one. And then that ties into the whole conversation of sustainability and carbon and Paris Accord and all the things. Like waste is front and center.
Gotcha. So just to recap then. So the first thing I'm going to the team and say, okay, provide me with a list of the options that I have for this building. You named 7 or 8. Let's say there are a couple other. Let's say there are 10 options out there. The second thing is, okay, what do I want my buildings to look like and what do I want my buildings to be branded with, right? And I guess what I'm hearing from you right now is that, okay, how can I pick the right cladding system, pick the right facade system that minimizes essentially waste and possibly brings me savings, if you may, in terms of less waste and less time on site when I'm building the building. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And so something has to start first, though. So I've got a project right now that it's been brought to me at rendering stage. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, the business plan was built around the rendering, right? Because that helped them decide how many units they're going to be selling and things like that. So, bringing an expert like myself in when they don't even know how many units they want to use on such and such a property, that's too early. But bringing a rendering in and then showing me like architects do a great job of this, showing me what they're trying to achieve potentially, and getting somebody like myself in early enough that, they're showing me what they want to achieve potentially, and they're trying to associate to certain colors and finishes in the neighborhood and all those other types of things that they're good at. Now it's time to maybe, hey, if you did it this way, could you compromise and therefore have less waste? Or, if you want that aesthetic and that dimension and that layout, here, there are 10 choices, but here are the 3 or 2 that you should think about even before you kind of go figure out the price. Because as I was saying earlier, a lot of I get calls all the time like, oh, how much is your panel? And it's kind of like why are you starting? That's the wrong
question. That's the wrong question. I've heard you say that many times. Yeah. And that's actually, I'm beginning to learn that as well. That's not the right question.
Which is fun for me because you get to change and you get to differentiate yourself. So, and, if there was a standard way of going through this process, it probably wouldn't need me, but there isn't. And it's different people's levels of understanding and different people's point of view of what they're trying to achieve. And there are a lot of choices, and there's more and more choices every day because there's a lot of innovation in the facade space. Everybody knows, it's kind of a joke, like there's a whole lot more wall than there is roof.
That's true. That's true.
Except for the Home Depot store.
So if I want to go back, so basically I now know when I need to bring Blair in, or someone like Blair with the expertise to help select the right system. Then basically the other criteria was range, what my branding wants to look like. But now how do I make a decision? Like walk me through, if you may, that decision-making criteria from your perspective. How should I be looking at a facade system? Like obviously there's performance, like you mentioned, waste and cost, and I can add my 2 cents to that in terms of being a construction manager, that I want less people to touch the system. That's my point of view. I don't want too many people to go back and have to repeat and repiece these systems together. So I totally agree with that. What else should I be looking at?
Well, nowadays you're going to have to start at the building code. So you may, like we've been talking about finishes and services and things you might see, but you do need to understand the building code of what you're actually going to be building. And I guess you're going to, like, this is where I get a little philosophical, but you can sit in a room. I don't sit in these rooms, but you can sit in a room and say, I just barely want to get over the Ontario building code. So,
Right.
and like that, I was in Kingston this weekend at my son's. He's just moved into a place to go to grad school, and he's in one of these 10-story buildings, blocked and window wall. And I was bored, so I sat and looked at his building envelope, and I added up exactly, and I added up the wall depth, and then I also figured out there was a thermal bridge between the window and the inside, and a handful of other things, and it's pretty clear to me that the owner had a meeting and said, building code's here. I want to be just about here.
Just meet the code.
They have the legal right to do that. Absolutely.
Right.
However, the code's changing. Now it's changing very regularly, and things like the Toronto Green Standard are catching on fast, and they're being copied in other districts of Ontario and other places. So the idea that you build a building today and then down the street, the next person has to build a building that's better. What happened to the marketability of the building you didn't build better? And
right.
And by the way, these Toronto Green Standard practices, they're not mysteries. Like, they've come out and said, here's where we are going. And
right.
And so if you build today, you have a very knowledgeable choice about how to build where it's going to be. Wayne Gretzky, go where the puck's going to be. But you still can make a decision on where the code is today. Now, I did some backwards math this morning based on what I saw, and I went back and read SB 10 and added it all up. And I think there's a slight chance they're at building code. And
the building in Kingston, the one that your son moved to.
Yeah. And it doesn't reflect how this building is going to perform. And Kingston is a windy place. And it was really cold on the weekend when it actually was only about -3. And so the building code doesn't actually, it's a proxy for how we should build, but it's not, right? And you couldn't really ever come up with a building, like it would take forever to come up with a building code that covered every scenario,
covers
right?
everything. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but
that makes sense.
But when you watch the weather report tomorrow morning, what are you going to be looking for? The wind chill. So
right,
that building has a wind chill like you wouldn't believe it.
Right. So I get you're saying is, look at what your options are. Obviously, you have the building code. You want to meet that for sure. You have to meet that. But I guess I'm hearing the performance is the next criteria on your list. Like, what performance are we getting? I'm curious to know, of all the systems that you're reviewing, you work with, you've studied. Obviously, we just established that you are a building facade nerd, if you may. You just did the math sitting there. Which ones would you say are the better fits for our climate in Toronto and in Ontario in terms of performance and basically the energy cost and energy efficiency of the building, I guess, over its long term, over its life cycle, if you may?
The outer skin doesn't really matter in what I've just said. A ventilated facade with pretty well any of the well-manufactured skins is fine. Now, that's a budget and a branding question like we had earlier. But when you're looking at how you're going to build the wall, whether it's stick built, and that's why I come back to the glass for a minute, there's work going on in the curtain wall space where the types of materials I'm talking about are being integrated in curtain wall. There are prefab walls, and there's modular, and all those, probably is three more webinars are to cover all that. But I think and answer your question in one simple word, it's flexibility. So if you're choosing a wall solution, so the whole thermally broken, insulated air vapor solution, and only does one thing, like it only goes to 4 inches. It has no adjustability. It's kind of hard to deal with the window detailing. You caused yourself some pain you didn't have to cause. And an example of these buildings and their performance, just one simple thing, is slab exposure. So the thermal bridge that goes through a slab is insane. So if you've created a system like window wall that goes slab to slab, and then when you go on the websites of this window wall guys, they have a thing they call bypass, I think is the word they use. And it's fundamentally an aesthetic. So it looks like curtain wall, but it's not, right? So that, yeah, you know what I was saying, you'd build these things. But the bypass, so you go for a window wall that's like that might, have, reasonable U value depending on how it's made. But then the slab comes out like this, and all of a sudden you've got, 1 inch of insulation for that bypass. And what thermal bridges are going on from side to side and whether it's been put on right, all that kind of stuff. That's not a flexible system. And if you want to start talking about higher performance, oh, by the way, the higher performance may not cost more, because if you want to go from, say, 4 inches to 6 inches of insulation, the cost of the insulation and the subsystem is not that much. Like it's like,
But I guess on the bigger picture of things, what you're saying is that if you were to select a building that has significantly more glass compared to more wall, the one with the glass is probably going to have a lesser performance, if I'm hearing you right.
well, that and you're not going to be able to. So a big part of these codes is driving down the window to wall ratio. They're not saying, hey, if you have 100% glass, you better have it that perform like that. They're not doing that. They're saying your window to wall ratio is going down. So jury's gone, gone home. The verdict is on the table. So
I might have this question come up that, okay, right now in Toronto, we see all these, I wouldn't say mid-rise, but all these high-rise buildings having basically all these glass cubes going up to like how many, God knows how many stories right now. How do you feel about that like this?
obviously I don't like it. We're going to pay the price. This isn't Miami, right? I don't know how they got it. Now, there was a point in time where the code was changing. I think it was the year or so last, and I couldn't reach an architect for about 6 weeks because they were jamming in all their approval requests, because the approval request to the city had to be, mail stamped May the 31st. So they just whatever they put in their documents, it didn't matter if the city had more questions later. They just get it stamped and get it in, and we'll deal with it. And it was all to keep the requirements on the building envelope status quo. So I don't know how it's happening, but it's not good, and we're going to pay the price. And the second piece is I have met curtain wall renovators who know they're going to retire based on replacing gaskets coming in the next 20 years. So somebody's paying for that. And then the third thing I see when I walk downtown is balconies, and the thermal bridging that comes off of balconies is insane. And I mean, I know people who live in some of those high rises, and they tell me that in the wintertime, they can't walk over that part of their floor. Wow. And if you have that kind of cold floor, you're going to be having condensation. So you do have to ask yourself why we created these buildings with balconies all the way around them.
Yeah.
And then
it adds a whole bunch of complexity to construction as well.
Yeah. And I love it when you go by those buildings and you look up and there's bicycles and no human beings.
Yeah, I used to live in one end on the top floor, and you're right. Like there were probably a few number of weeks in the year that those balconies were actually used because of all the wind and on the cool weather. Okay, so let me just go recap from the beginning. So I want to ask about the range. I want to talk about the branding. I want to know about the performance. I want to know about the code. I want to know about the branding. And then, I've selected the system. I want to go forward. and you made a point here that there's a building that's going to go up down the block from my building there 2 years from now, 5 years from now. And I want to make sure that by the time that building is built, I'm still in the market, competitive, sorry. And so that brings me to the next question is, what are the actual trends? We talked about the code a little bit, but what is it that you're actually seeing in the market? And I know from previous discussions, you and I, that you're trying to focus on the mid-rise section a little bit more because that might actually be more flexible. So maybe walk us through the opportunities that you're seeing and trends that you're seeing happening right now.
Well, I'm focused. I grow a business, so I'm focused on where I have things or where I can find things that people want, right?
Yeah.
So the mid-rise space, so like maybe less than 12 stories, I look out west and I see smaller balconies, not hung out, they're part of the building, panels, so cladding systems that are lighter and maybe prettier and easy to put on. And then maybe brick around the bottom because there's still an aesthetic people like about brick.
Right.
But that's just on the first floor. Really interesting massing, attractive places for the neighborhood. And I'm thinking that belongs here. And so I'm going, it works over there. Why wouldn't it work here?
That's true. That's true. And
so
you just mentioned a couple of important points there, and I think it's worth talking about a little bit. One is the neighborhoods, because I have had discussions about this before, where you obviously, when you're building a mid-rise building, you're building in an area that you're not in the middle of nowhere. You're building somewhere that other people have lived for a long time. You have other buildings that give the community the fabric. It has its own identity. So I guess that's one of the places that you want to think about facade, which is like basically your building should mesh in other words, right? You want to make sure that does.
Yeah, I'm not a designer, so I'm not necessarily comfortable with the word mesh in, because if it actually enlightens the neighborhood, then this is a good thing, right? I've been reading a lot. I also do work in schools, and I've been reading a lot about the benefit of color and aesthetics and finish and, of course, daylighting and other things for the educational process. So I could see, because if you were saying mesh is in, I'm sorry to pick on your words, then every building would have red Ontario brick.
I hear you. So we built this building a few years back that we had to keep a heritage facade of a church and build a 4-story condo behind it. And at the time, the heritage architect and the design architect that we were working with, they had a good point. They were saying, listen, this building was brick to begin with. So whatever we do, we want to somewhat have a relationship with the old wall, but also be a little bit different. So in that particular case, we ended up doing basically a different type of brick and architectural block that looked a little bit different, but is still not like a sore thumb when you looked at the whole neighborhood. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, frankly, and you know this, it comes from my basically bias against mid-rise buildings, because I wouldn't personally like to see a big glass box in the middle of a good old neighborhood. Like, that's not what I advocate for.
Yeah. When I saw the same thing in Europe, when I was over for that show, or when I went to visit some of my suppliers, I mean, you have a 500-year-old building and you're building next to it, or you're actually adding to it. One was a hospital. They used terracotta panels to somewhat relate to it, but it was a very modern building next to a very old building, and it came off perfectly. And that's why I'm saying designers have a very important role in meeting inspirational requirements. Like,
one of the things I'm seeing on the construction side, and it's actually pretty good, like I'm very happy to see it, is prefabrication, offsite fabrication, and manufacturing, which honestly, it really helps us during construction process. It helps us with coordination, human error. To your previous point, reducing waste. Like, what are the trends that you're seeing there with the facade systems?
So I'd say what you say about that is it's coming.
Not there yet.
No. There are some, like, it is a little hard with mid-rise or even any like residential. It's because of all the penetrations. They can be a little hard. On the other hand, what helps it is repetitiveness. So if you can ship a bunch of walls that are somewhat the same, because that's how you drive down costs in a
True.
prefab building is you have repetitiveness. But that is happening, but I can't count on like less than 5 factories in Eastern Canada doing that.
But you see it
Now
coming.
they are not, and it is happening in bigger buildings. I mean, it has been
Right.
happening for quite some time. So there's some companies out of the States that do, 3-story high by 10, 15 feet wide panels, and they put it up and they have cool facades. And I saw that on some university buildings. There's a couple, 3 companies here in Ontario that are going after, that kind of space. And I think what you'll see is a bit of a trickle down to the residential building world.
So
There's a
there's still hope. There's still hope. It might not be
Oh,
there,
no,
but there's
no.
hope.
Yeah, but demand kind of has to lead supply to some extent. I mean, it goes like this, right? But
Right.
but if I have to convince people, I don't convince people. That's not what I do for a living. But if the industry is looking at the Ontario Building Code and only doing that, then how are they going to spawn interest in some new way of building it?
Although
Now
I agree
modulars.
with you that although I agree with you that the good chunk of the market obviously is very cost sensitive when it comes to real estate development, and they're not necessarily going to go above and beyond what they have to. But there are entities out there that I'm fortunate to be working with a few of them that actually do have objectives that are higher, and it's actually admiring, and it's very important, I think, to
Yeah.
what you're saying is that yeah, well, like look at where we are compared to what we built 50 years ago in terms of the quality of the building envelope, the quality of the construction itself. And I actually do believe that we were turning over better product at the end of the day these days. And yeah, we don't want to be looking at hindsight and saying, you know what, we could have done 10% better and it would have made a huge difference, right? So,
Yeah, I agree with all that. Now, we don't have time for it, but modular is probably coming faster for mid-rise construction or for
mhm.
residential construction in general. And there are some good companies in Ontario that are,
Yeah.
moving along with it. Nowhere near the progress that is going on in the States, but
Hey, listen,
that area,
that's your point. There's opportunity for growth, right? Hopefully,
yes,
with more
yeah,
demand in the market on the mid-rise and these new changes that have been happening recently to the guidelines and zoning, it will. I'm pretty sure, like I'm certain that we're going to see more mid-rise buildings come online, and
yeah,
those will be the main drivers. Honestly, like I don't think we're going to see massive changes in terms of how the high-rise buildings, the 40 stories and the 80 stories are being built. I don't foresee that in the near future, and please disagree with you if you think differently. I think the facades for mid-rise buildings and like something between 4 to 10, maybe 12 stories, that's where the main playground will be.
we'll have another meeting about high rise. But you asked me about prefab walls, and I actually think volumetric modular would move
Right.
into the construction process for 12-story or less buildings faster than prefab wall because it is an easier construction process. It is repeatable. Every suite can be the same size. And then if you want 2 suites, you just take the wall down and have 2 suites. So there's a lot of
I just
opportunity
made
to
a note
do.
here. We should have another chat on the whole modular system because you're right.
Yeah.
I've been to a
Yeah.
few of those plans and they're pretty interesting. I don't know. Maybe that's actually a good question to look into. Why is it that they're not growing much faster? I guess maybe that's one of my questions because I remember just before COVID, I visited one of these plants that they were doing modular, and it's pretty impressive. The robotics, the
Yeah.
systems that they have, and it's the closest thing in the construction industry I've seen that goes close to the car manufacturing system, which is, I guess, one of the good benchmarks to want to follow, right? Okay, so I guess I'm just going to do a recap and then I'm going to ask you a few closing questions, if you may. So, if I'm a new developer or I'm a developer who is starting a new project, I want to ask for the range. I want to think about my branding. I want to think about the product that I'm selecting as in compliance with the code. At the end of the day, I want to pick something that I don't regret 5 years, 10 years from now that, okay, I could have done 10% better and this building would have been different? Did I miss anything, or is that it?
I didn't say it, so it's my fault, but sustainability, carbon impact, environmental impact. I did mention waste. And when I have meetings with architects and engineers on other types of buildings, we really delve into carbon a lot. Like I get asked to provide, environmental product declarations over and over and over again, to the point that's great. I'm very excited by it. My sort of normal comment is you can't have protests in Glasgow at, COP, whatever it was, and then just sort of go to work the next day. Like it just doesn't make any sense, let alone if you feel like we all should figure out a way to impact it, right? So that should be a key aspect, because if you're going to contribute to neighborhoods, you should be thinking about it.
So in terms of like resources, websites, magazines, books, or anything that you could recommend or suggest that our audience would, if they want to learn more about facades, obviously you have your own website, which I'm going to ask you to spell out the address there and we'll include it in the show notes. But aside from that, where can we learn more about facades? What is it that we talked about a few of the main key points that we should be looking for. How can we keep ourselves up to date?
Well, I guess it comes down to, if you want engineering, then things like Facade Tectonics, which is an industry group that is primarily building envelope folks. Ontario Building Envelope Council is another one. In fact, Wednesday, they're having a session on pre-manufactured walls. And I think it's some Elliston people coming in. Can't remember now. But Ontario Building Envelope Councils are good people to join and not expensive, and they have great events. There are some other facade, I guess, organizations or associations. They tend to be run by places in other parts of the world, like the United States, and they tend to cater to big buildings. On the modular space, the Modular Building Institute is incredible. Great bunch of folks, and they have a lot of content. On build, I would recommend getting to Germany to build.
Okay. I think
I would obviously, I'd like to think of my own website, but there's a couple other companies like mine in Ontario that also have some good materials.
Yeah, I run your webinars and I've been part of a couple of them and they're pretty informative. So let's wrap up with that. Like, where can people find you? How can they reach out to you? You obviously mentioned at what stage it makes sense for you to be involved in the project. And maybe if you want to clarify on that and let us know how our audience can reach out to you, where to find you.
Well, my company is Facade Systems, Inc., and that's my website, Facade Systems, Inc. I have a lot of activity on LinkedIn. I publish about once to twice a week. 100,000 people viewed my posts last year, and somewhere around 500 likes and a whole whack of comments. So that really seems to be working. I'm not touting my own horn, but I believe it's bringing value. So you might want to join me there. Yes, I do webinars. I also send out emails on different topics, from anything from a specific product or technology. I try to come at it from a different point of view, maybe similar to our conversation today, but also topics that just may be interesting to you. So I sent e-blasts out about color about two or 3 months ago and had almost 10,000 people open them up. Yeah, that's more than my database. So, that went around some people's offices and people opened them. So those are a couple ways.
Okay, so folks, you heard him. If you're looking for more information, you know where to find him. And thank you very much, Blair. I really appreciate you being here. I'm hoping and I'm sure that our audience is going to find very useful information from this discussion. And thank you very much. And if you have any closing remarks.
I'm really pleased to be invited by him, and I think you're on an important mission. I think without good conversation with people who have a purpose, we aren't going to change. I think I spent a lot of time on code today. Right. Code isn't how we're going to be better at this. And there's a huge opportunity for Canadians to be the best at this on a global basis.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Just one last thing before you leave. We have developed a comprehensive guide of resources that people in the industry are using to make better decisions or keep themselves on top of the trends, learn about new products, technologies. These include books, websites, blog, podcasts, YouTube channels, apps, and softwares. And people are using them to make better design decisions, investment decisions, or engineering decisions. And I'm sure that you're going to find this very helpful, but hopefully it will save you dozens of hours when you need it, and who knows, maybe even more. This is a live document that we're going to keep updating every few months. Please go to our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, and you can get a free copy of this document for yourself, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, to get the free PDF resource. Thank you very much.